Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen who forged England's Golden Age. Part 1. England before Elizabeth. When Elizabeth Tudor was born on September 7, 1533, at Greenwich Palace, her father King Henry VIII was bitterly disappointed. He had broken with Rome, divorced his first wife Catherine of Aragon, and married the captivating Anne Boleyn for one purpose above all others: to secure a male heir. The arrival of a daughter was not what he had envisioned. Nevertheless, the infant princess was declared heir to the throne, and her father's previous daughter, Mary, was declared illegitimate. Elizabeth's early life would be defined by the violent religious and political upheavals that her father had set in motion. Anne Boleyn's fall came swiftly and brutally. In May 1536, when Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old, her mother was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. The accusations were almost certainly fabricated, orchestrated by Henry's chief minister Thomas Cromwell to provide the king with an exit from a marriage that had failed to produce a son. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded on Tower Green. Elizabeth, like her half-sister Mary before her, was now declared illegitimate by Act of Parliament. The little girl who had been second in line to the throne was suddenly nobody, a bastard princess with no clear future and no mother to protect her. Despite her precarious status, Elizabeth received an exceptional education. Her father, whatever his failures as a parent, understood the value of learning, and Elizabeth was placed in the care of remarkable tutors. Chief among them was Roger Ascham, a leading humanist scholar who taught her from 1548 onward. Under Ascham's guidance and that of other tutors including William Grindal, Elizabeth mastered an impressive array of languages. She became fluent in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, and had working knowledge of Spanish. Ascham later wrote admiringly of his royal pupil, noting that she read more Greek in a day than many clergymen read Latin in a week. This rigorous classical education would shape Elizabeth's intellect and her approach to governance for the rest of her life. The religious environment of Elizabeth's childhood was one of constant, dangerous flux. Henry VIII had broken with Rome, but retained much Catholic doctrine and ritual, creating a hybrid English church that satisfied neither traditional Catholics nor Protestant reformers. Elizabeth learned early to keep her religious opinions to herself, a skill that would prove invaluable. When Henry died in January 1547, he was succeeded by Elizabeth's 9-year-old half-brother Edward VI. The young king's reign saw England move decisively toward Protestantism under the guidance of Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, and later John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Elizabeth, living primarily at Hatfield House and other royal residences away from court, navigated these changes carefully, conforming outwardly to the new Protestant order while avoiding factional entanglements. Edward's reign brought Elizabeth both opportunity and danger. In 1549, she became dangerously entangled with Thomas Seymour, the uncle of the young king and husband of Henry VII's widow Catherine Parr. Seymour's flirtations with the teenage Elizabeth were inappropriate at best, and after Catherine Parr's death, Seymour harbored ambitions to marry Elizabeth herself. When Seymour was arrested for treason in early 1549, Elizabeth was interrogated intensively. She was only 15, but she demonstrated remarkable composure under pressure, denying any improper conduct and distancing herself from Seymour's schemes. It was an early test of her political survival skills, and she passed it successfully. When Edward VI died of tuberculosis in July 1553, Elizabeth faced her greatest danger yet. The young king, encouraged by Northumberland, had attempted to divert the succession away from his Catholic half-sister Mary and toward Lady Jane Grey, Northumberland's daughter-in-law. The coup failed after 9 days, and Mary entered London in triumph. Elizabeth rode into the city alongside her half-sister, but their relationship was fraught with mutual suspicion. Mary was a devout Catholic determined to restore England to papal obedience. Elizabeth was associated in many minds with the Protestant cause. Moreover, as long as Elizabeth lived, She represented an alternative focus of loyalty for those opposed to Mary's regime. The crisis came in early 1554, when Sir Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion against Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain. Wyatt's rebellion was partly motivated by religious opposition to Mary's Catholicism and partly by xenophobic fear of Spanish influence, but many suspected that Elizabeth was the intended beneficiary. Although Elizabeth was almost certainly not involved in the conspiracy, her position was perilous. She was summoned to court, and when illness delayed her journey, Mary's patience snapped. In March 1554, Elizabeth was taken to the Tower of London, entering through the Traitor's Gate where her mother had entered 18 years before. She reportedly sat on the steps in the rain, refusing at first to go inside, insisting on her innocence. Elizabeth spent 2 months in the Tower, never knowing whether each day might bring news of her trial and execution. Her imprisonment was a terrifying ordeal, but she maintained her composure and her protestations of loyalty to Queen Mary. Crucially, no solid evidence linking her to Wyatt's conspiracy could be found. In May, she was released from the Tower but placed under house arrest at Woodstock in Oxfordshire, under the supervision of Sir Henry Bedingfeld. For nearly a year, Elizabeth lived in this suspended state, permitted few visitors, her correspondence monitored, her future uncertain. She occupied herself with her studies and with careful management of her relationship with Bedingfeld, never openly defying him but constantly maneuvering for small advantages. Gradually, as Mary's regime stabilized and the immediate panic following Wyatt's rebellion subsided, Elizabeth's position improved slightly. By 1555, she was allowed to return to Hatfield, though still under a form of supervision. She lived quietly through the remainder of Mary's reign, attending Mass as required, but avoiding any action that might be construed as disloyalty or any association with the Protestant exile community or with plots against the Queen. It was a masterclass in political survival. Elizabeth had learned from childhood that loyalty could shift, that religious opinion was dangerous, and that survival required infinite patience and careful self-presentation. By the time Mary fell mortally ill in the autumn of 1558, Elizabeth had spent 25 years preparing for the role she was about to assume. Sources Elizabeth I. Anne Somerset pp. 321, 3548 Elizabeth. Apprenticeship David Starkey pp. 934-67 To the Life of Elizabeth I. Alison Weir pp. 1258 Elizabeth I. Christopher Haig pp. 819 Part 2 Becoming Queen. On the morning of November 17, 1558, a delegation of Mary's counselors rode to Hatfield House to inform Elizabeth that her half-sister was dead and that she was now Queen of England. According to a likely apocryphal but symbolically powerful account, Elizabeth received the news in the park at Hatfield and responded in Latin, "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." Whether or not those exact words were spoken, the sentiment reflected the magnitude of the moment. Against all odds, the bastard daughter of the executed Anne Boleyn had survived to inherit the throne. The England that Elizabeth inherited in 1558 was in a precarious state. The country was religiously divided and exhausted by the reversals of the previous decades. Under Edward VI, England had become officially Protestant. Under Mary, Catholicism had been restored with brutal enforcement that saw nearly 300 Protestants burned as heretics. This religious whiplash had created deep uncertainty and resentment. The treasury was effectively empty, drained by Mary's unsuccessful war against France in alliance with Spain. That war had ended in humiliation with the loss of Calais, England's last continental possession, in January 1558. Foreign observers regarded England as a second-rate power, poor in resources and unstable in government, a satellite of the Habsburg Empire. Elizabeth faced immediate and critical decisions. Her coronation took place on January 15, 1559, a date chosen by her astrologer John Dee as auspicious. The ceremony itself was carefully choreographed to balance religious factions. The coronation mass was celebrated according to Catholic rite, but in English rather than Latin, and the bishop who crowned her, Owen Oglethorpe of Carlisle, was selected because most senior churchmen had refused to participate in the crowning of a queen they regarded as illegitimate. Elizabeth's coronation procession through London, however, revealed her instinct for public relations. She stopped frequently to speak with ordinary citizens, received gifts and flowers from children, and responded to pageants organized by the city with visible pleasure. These were calculated gestures designed to establish a bond between the new queen and her subjects. The composition of Elizabeth's government demonstrated both continuity and change. She retained several of Mary's counselors, recognizing the need for experienced administrators, but the key appointment was William Cecil as principal secretary. Cecil, who had served Edward VI but survived Mary's reign without significant involvement in her government, would remain Elizabeth's closest advisor for the next 40 years. Their partnership was one of mutual respect and complementary talents. Elizabeth provided vision, charisma, and final authority. Cecil provided administrative skill, tireless work ethic, and sound judgment. Other important early appointments included Nicholas Bacon as Lord Keeper and the Earl of Arundel as Lord Steward. Elizabeth deliberately kept her Privy Council smaller than her sisters had been, making decision-making more efficient. From the moment of her accession, Elizabeth faced relentless pressure to marry. In 16th-century thinking, a woman could not rule alone. She needed a husband to provide military leadership, diplomatic strength, and above all, heirs. Parliament, the Privy Council, and foreign ambassadors all urged Elizabeth to marry quickly. The question was not whether she would marry, but whom. Catholic Europe hoped she might marry a Catholic prince, thereby returning England to the Roman fold. Spanish diplomats initially proposed Philip II himself, recently widowed by Mary's death, but Elizabeth politely declined. Other foreign candidates included Archdukes of Austria, Swedish princes, and various French royalty. Each potential marriage carried enormous political implications and risks. The most personally significant and politically complicated courtship involved Robert Dudley, later Earl of Leicester, whom Elizabeth had known since childhood. Dudley was handsome, charismatic, and shared Elizabeth's love of riding and courtly entertainment. By 1559, he was clearly the Queen's favorite, and rumors of a romance circulated throughout Europe. The situation became scandalous when Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead at the bottom of a staircase at Cumnor Place in September 1560. The death was officially ruled accidental, but suspicions of murder were inevitable. Whether Elizabeth had ever seriously considered marrying Dudley before, the scandal made such a marriage politically impossible. Any union with a man suspected of murdering his wife to clear the way for a queen would have destroyed Elizabeth's reputation and destabilized her regime. Nevertheless, Dudley remained at court as her favorite for decades, their relationship an enduring source of speculation. Elizabeth's refusal to commit to marriage was not mere caprice. Marriage to a foreign prince would subordinate English interests to those of the husband's country and risk foreign domination. Marriage to an English nobleman would elevate one faction over others, creating dangerous resentments among the aristocracy. Moreover, marriage would inevitably reduce Elizabeth's own authority. A husband would expect to govern. By remaining unmarried, Elizabeth retained sole control. As the years passed, her unmarried state evolved from a temporary condition into a deliberate political identity. The image of the Virgin Queen emerged gradually, transforming what had initially been seen as a problem into a source of mystique and power. Elizabeth presented herself as married to England, her coronation ring symbolizing this union. She cultivated the imagery of Gloriana, the Virgin dedicated entirely to her people's welfare. This image building was sophisticated and effective. Elizabeth's court became a stage for elaborate displays of loyalty and devotion, with courtiers competing for royal favor through the language of chivalric romance. The Queen was celebrated in poetry and pageantry as Astrea, the goddess of justice, as Deborah the biblical judge, as Diana the virgin huntress. This iconography served multiple purposes. It justified female rule by invoking powerful female archetypes. It channeled the emotional and political energies of her courtiers into controlled channels, and it created a compelling public identity that transcended the limitations contemporaries associated with female monarchy. By the mid-1560s, Elizabeth had consolidated her power more effectively than many had thought possible for a woman ruling alone. Sources Elizabeth I. Anne Somerset pp. 6298, 112-135 Elizabeth I and her court, Susan Doran pp. 2247 Elizabeth I. Wallace T. McCaffrey pp. 4573 The Life of Elizabeth I. Alison Weir pp. 6294 Part 3 Religion and Government. The religious question was the most dangerous issue Elizabeth faced, and her solution was characteristically pragmatic. The Elizabethan religious settlement of 1559 was a carefully calculated compromise designed to establish a Church of England that would be acceptable to the widest possible range of opinion. The Act of Supremacy restored royal authority over the English Church, though Elizabeth significantly chose the title Supreme Governor rather than Supreme Head, a subtle distinction that made the measure more palatable to those uncomfortable with a woman exercising ecclesiastical authority. The Act of Uniformity imposed a revised Book of Common Prayer that incorporated both Protestant theology and elements of traditional ceremonial. Church services would be in English, clergy could marry, and the doctrine was essentially Protestant, but vestments and some ritual elements retained a more Catholic appearance. This middle way satisfied neither committed Catholics nor ardent Protestants, which was precisely Elizabeth's intention. She sought to minimize religious conflict by avoiding theological extremes and focusing on outward conformity rather than interior belief. Catholics who attended Church of England services and did not actively resist the settlement were largely left alone, at least in the early years of the reign. Puritans, those Protestants who wanted further reformation to purge the Church of all popish remnants, were frustrated by Elizabeth's insistence on retaining bishops, vestments, and set liturgy, but they were not persecuted provided they remained within the established church structure. This relative tolerance could not last. In 1570, Pope Pius V issued the papal bull Regnans in Excelsis *, excommunicating Elizabeth and declaring her deposed. The bull released her Catholic subjects from their allegiance and effectively branded them potential traitors. This transformed English Catholicism from a private matter of conscience into a security threat. Catholic missionary priests, trained at seminaries in Douai and Rome and later reinforced by Jesuits, began infiltrating England to maintain and revive Catholic faith. Their presence created an agonizing dilemma for English Catholics. To harbor a priest was treason, but to abandon their faith was spiritual death. A series of Catholic plots against Elizabeth's life made the threat concrete. The Ridolfi plot of 1571 envisioned a Spanish invasion to place Mary, Queen of Scots, on the English throne. The conspiracy was uncovered by Francis Walsingham's intelligence network, leading to the execution of the Duke of Norfolk, England's premier nobleman. The Throckmorton plot of 1583 similarly involved Spanish and French support for a Catholic uprising. Most dangerous of all was the Babington plot of 1586, in which Anthony Babington and other young Catholic gentlemen planned Elizabeth's assassination. Walsingham's agents infiltrated the conspiracy and crucially obtained letters from Mary, Queen of Scots, apparently approving the assassination plan. Mary Stuart had been Elizabeth's prisoner since 1568, when she fled Scotland after being forced to abdicate. As Elizabeth's Catholic cousin with her own claim to the English throne, Mary was a perpetual danger, a focus for Catholic conspiracy whether she actively encouraged it or not. For nearly 19 years, Elizabeth resisted calls to execute Mary, held at various locations in England under guard. The Babington plot changed the calculation. Walsingham had clear evidence of Mary's complicity in a plot to murder Elizabeth. Parliament demanded Mary's trial and execution. Elizabeth's councillors, led by William Cecil, now Lord Burghley, and Walsingham, insisted that as long as Mary lived, Elizabeth's life was in danger. Mary was tried in October 1586 and found guilty. Elizabeth signed the death warrant in February 1587, but claimed afterward that she had not authorized its immediate delivery. This display of reluctance, whether genuine or performed, served Elizabeth's purposes. Mary was eliminated, but Elizabeth could claim she had not wished it. Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle on February 8, 1587. She died with dignity and courage, asserting her Catholic faith and her status as a martyred queen. Her death resolved one danger but created another. It removed any restraint on Philip II of Spain, who now prepared for outright war against England. Elizabeth's government functioned through a complex network of institutions. The Privy Council, consisting of 18 to 20 members, met regularly to advise the Queen and coordinate policy. Parliament met irregularly, called only when the Crown needed new taxation or legislation. Elizabeth regarded Parliament as a necessary evil and managed it carefully, using loyal councillors in both houses to guide proceedings, and employing her considerable personal charisma when necessary to win support. She became adept at the art of parliamentary management, granting just enough to maintain cooperation while firmly resisting any encroachment on royal prerogative. When Parliament presumptively debated her marriage or the succession, she rebuked them sharply, reminding them of the limits of their authority. Royal finances were a perpetual challenge. England was poor compared to France or Spain, and the Crown's ordinary revenues were insufficient for extraordinary expenses like war. Elizabeth was extremely frugal, avoiding costly foreign adventures and managing her household expenses carefully. She relied on traditional sources of revenue, including customs duties, crown lands, and parliamentary taxation, voted for specific purposes. This parsimony sometimes frustrated her more aggressive councillors and limited England's military capabilities, but it also maintained financial stability and kept taxation relatively low, contributing to her popularity. Local government depended on the unpaid service of the gentry as justices of the peace. These local magistrates enforced law, regulated economic activity, oversaw poor relief, and maintained order in their counties. The system was remarkably effective and remarkably cheap, relying on the self-interest and social authority of the governing class. Elizabeth's government also maintained an increasingly sophisticated bureaucracy for collecting revenue, managing crown lands, and administering justice through various courts. The combination of conciliar government at the center, parliamentary cooperation when necessary, and gentry administration in the localities created a system that was flexible, relatively efficient, and capable of responding to the multiple crises of Elizabeth's reign. Sources: The Elizabethan Puritan Movement, Patrick Collinson, pp. 2756, The Later Reformation in England, Diarmaid MacCulloch, pp. 4268, Elizabeth I. Christopher Haig, pp. 2441, 6789, Elizabeth, The Forgotten Years, John Guy, pp. 4267 Part 4, The Spanish Armada. Philip II of Spain had once been married to Elizabeth's half-sister Mary, and had initially hoped to maintain the Anglo-Spanish alliance by marrying Elizabeth herself. By the 1580s, those hopes were long dead, replaced by bitter antagonism. The sources of conflict were multiple: religious, political, and economic. Elizabeth's England was Protestant and supported Dutch rebels fighting against Spanish rule in the Netherlands. English privateers, operating with semi-official approval, raided Spanish shipping and settlements in the Americas. The most famous of these sea raiders was Francis Drake, whose circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580 had included devastating attacks on Spanish possessions along the Pacific coast of South America. When Drake returned with a fortune in plundered treasure, Elizabeth knighted him aboard his ship, the Golden Hind, a deliberate provocation to Spain. The Dutch revolt had created a festering wound in Spanish power. The Netherlands, rich provinces under Spanish Habsburg rule, had rebelled against Philip's attempts to impose religious uniformity and centralized control. Elizabeth provided covert aid to the Dutch rebels for years, fearing that if Spain crushed the revolt, the Spanish Netherlands would become a base for invasion of England. In 1585, she made her support explicit, sending an expeditionary force under the Earl of Leicester to assist the Dutch. This direct military intervention, combined with Drake's raid on Spanish Caribbean ports in 1585-1586 and Mary Stuart's execution in 1587, convinced Philip that England must be conquered. Philip began assembling a massive invasion fleet, the Enterprise of England. The Spanish Armada was intended to sail up the English Channel, rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army in the Spanish Netherlands, and transport that veteran force across the Channel to invade England. The fleet that eventually sailed in May 1588 comprised approximately 130 ships carrying some 30,000 men. It was the largest naval expedition attempted in European waters up to that time. Command was given to the Duke of Medina Sidonia, an experienced administrator and military commander, though not primarily a naval officer. The Armada's departure was delayed by Drake's audacious raid on Cadiz in 1587, which destroyed ships and supplies in what Drake called singeing the King of Spain's beard. Armada was sighted off Cornwall in late July 1588. Beacons blazed along the English coast to spread the warning. The English fleet, commanded by Lord Howard of Effingham with Drake as vice-admiral, sailed from Plymouth to shadow the Spanish fleet up the Channel. The English had certain tactical advantages. Their ships were more maneuverable, their guns had longer range, and they were fighting in home waters. The Spanish ships, many of them converted merchantmen, were designed for boarding and close combat, tactics that required getting alongside the enemy. The English refused to allow this, maintaining distance and subjecting the Spanish to artillery bombardment. A series of engagements occurred as the Armada progressed up the Channel. At Portland Bill, off the Isle of Wight and near the French coast, the English attacked but inflicted limited damage. Spanish discipline held, and the fleet maintained its defensive crescent formation. On July 27, the Armada anchored off Calais, waiting for word from Parma. The rendezvous was the plan's fatal weakness. Parma's army was blockaded in harbor by Dutch ships, and coordinating the junction of the fleet and army proved impossible. That night, the English sent 8 fireships into the anchored Spanish fleet. The fireships themselves caused no significant damage, but they forced the Spanish to cut their anchors and scatter in disorder to avoid being burned. The following day, July 29, the fleets met off Gravelines in the most intense engagement of the campaign. At close range, English gunnery battered the Spanish ships, sinking or severely damaging several. The Armada's formation was broken, and casualties mounted. Only the onset of night and the exhaustion of English ammunition ended the battle. The wind then shifted, driving the Spanish fleet northward into the North Sea. With no anchors and no possibility of returning down the Channel against wind and enemy, Medina Sidonia ordered the fleet to sail around Scotland and Ireland to reach home. The voyage became a nightmare. Atlantic storms wrecked dozens of ships on the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland, and thousands of Spaniards drowned or were killed by hostile locals when they came ashore. Fewer than half the ships that had sailed returned to Spain. Elizabeth traveled to Tilbury on August 9, where English land forces were assembled to repel the invasion. There she delivered her most famous speech, declaring to the troops, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." The authenticity of this speech has been questioned by some historians, as the only sources are later accounts, but whether Elizabeth spoke exactly those words or not, the image of the Queen rallying her forces at Tilbury became a powerful component of the Armada legend. England's victory over the Armada was not primarily the result of superior English skill or courage, though both played a role. The Spanish plan was fundamentally flawed, requiring a complex coordination between fleet and army that geography and enemy action made impossible to achieve. English naval tactics exploited Spanish vulnerabilities, but it was the storms that inflicted the heaviest losses. Nevertheless, the outcome was strategically decisive. Spain had attempted to conquer England and had failed catastrophically. The psychological impact was immense. Protestant England's survival seemed providential, confirmation that God favored Elizabeth and the Protestant cause. Medals were struck with the inscription, "God blew," and they were scattered. Philip II would attempt further naval expeditions against England in the 1590s, but none approached the scale of 1588, and none succeeded. England remained independent, Protestant, and increasingly confident in its naval capabilities. Sources Elizabeth I, Anne Somerset, pp. 334–367, Elizabeth I, Wallace T. McCaffrey, pp. 198–20, For the Life of Elizabeth I, Alison Weir, pp. 384–12, Elizabeth I and Her Court, Susan Doran, pp. 89–103 Part 5. England's Golden Age. The years following the Armada saw an extraordinary flowering of English culture and a significant expansion of English involvement in the wider world. Exploration and overseas trade increased dramatically, driven by a combination of commercial ambition, strategic competition with Spain, and personal adventurism. Francis Drake had already circumnavigated the globe. Other navigators now attempted to find new routes to Asia and to establish English claims in North America. Walter Raleigh, courtier, poet, and adventurer, sponsored expeditions to North America, attempting to establish a colony on Roanoke Island in what is now North Carolina. The settlement, founded in 1585 and re-established in 1587, ultimately failed, its colonists disappearing without trace, but it represented an early English foothold in the Americas. English merchants pushed aggressively into markets previously dominated by other powers. The Levant Company, chartered in 1581, developed trade with the Ottoman Empire. Most significant for England's future was the foundation of the East India Company in 1600, which received a royal charter granting it monopoly rights to English trade with Asia. These commercial ventures were often indistinguishable from strategic and military enterprises, as English merchants competed with Portuguese, Dutch, and Spanish rivals for access to valuable commodities like spices, silk, and precious metals. The expansion of English trade contributed to London's rapid growth and increasing importance as a commercial and financial center. London in Elizabeth's reign was a dynamic, crowded, and often unpleasant city of perhaps 200,000 inhabitants by 1600, making it one of Europe's largest cities. The city's narrow streets and timber-framed buildings were prone to fire and disease. Outbreaks of bubonic plague occurred regularly, killing thousands. The River Thames served as the city's main highway, crowded with boats ferrying passengers and goods. London Bridge, lined with shops and houses, was the only bridge across the Thames until the 18th century. South of the river, in the area outside the city's jurisdiction, entertainment districts flourished, including bear-baiting arenas, brothels, and, most famously, theaters. The Elizabethan theater was one of the age's greatest achievements. Public playhouses, beginning with the theater built by James Burbage in 1576, provided entertainment for a broad cross-section of London society. Admission was cheap for standing room in the yard, more expensive for seats in the galleries. Performances took place in daylight in open-air amphitheaters that could hold over 2,000 spectators. The theater companies were commercial enterprises operating under the patronage of aristocrats, including the Queen herself. The Lord Chamberlain's Men, later the King's Men, was the company to which William Shakespeare belonged. William Shakespeare, born in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1564, arrived in London sometime in the late 1580s, and by the 1590s had established himself as the era's preeminent playwright. His plays, ranging from histories to comedies to tragedies, demonstrated an unprecedented mastery of language, character, and dramatic structure. Works like Romeo and Juliet*, A Midsummer Night's Dream*, Henry V*, Hamlet*, and King Lear transcended their immediate context to explore universal human experiences and emotions. Shakespeare was not alone. Christopher Marlowe, whose career was cut short by his death in 1593, wrote powerful dramas including Dr. Faustus and Tamburlaine*. Ben Jonson, Thomas Kyd, and others contributed to a theatrical culture of remarkable vitality and sophistication. English poetry also flourished. Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, published in parts between 1590 and 1596, was an elaborate allegorical epic celebrating Elizabeth as Gloriana and exploring themes of virtue, governance, and Protestant nationhood. Sir Philip Sidney's Astrophel and Stella, published posthumously in 1591, refined the sonnet sequence into an English art form. The culture of Elizabeth's court encouraged literary production, as courtiers sought to demonstrate their refinement and loyalty through verse. Elizabeth herself was an accomplished poet and translator, though she wrote primarily for personal or diplomatic purposes rather than publication. Music was integral to Elizabethan court and cultural life. Composers like William Ballard, Thomas Tallis, and John Dowland created sophisticated works for voices and instruments. Ballard, a Catholic who nonetheless retained Elizabeth's favor, composed masses, motets, and music for the Anglican service, as well as keyboard works and madrigals. The madrigal, an Italian form adapted by English composers, became wildly popular in the 1590s. Domestic music making was a standard accomplishment for educated people, and Elizabeth herself was an accomplished virginals player. Scientific and intellectual inquiry advanced as well, though within limits. Mathematics, astronomy, and navigational science developed in response to practical needs of exploration and warfare. John Dee, mathematician, astrologer, and advisor to Elizabeth, embodied the era's blend of empirical investigation and mystical speculation. Medical knowledge remained primitive by later standards, still based largely on ancient humoral theory, but anatomical study was advancing. Francis Bacon, though his major works came after Elizabeth's death, was formulating ideas about empirical investigation that would shape the scientific revolution. The expansion of printing made books more widely available than ever before, though literacy remained limited, perhaps 30% of men and 10% of women by the end of the reign. Printed works included not only literature and religious texts, but also practical manuals, almanacs, broadside ballads, and news pamphlets. The dissemination of ideas accelerated, contributing to both cultural vitality and religious controversy. The government attempted to control printing through licensing and censorship, but enforcement was imperfect. For all its cultural achievements, Elizabethan England remained a society of stark inequalities and widespread hardship. Population growth, enclosure of common lands, and periodic harvest failures created serious poverty and vagrancy. The Poor Laws of 1598 and 1601 represented an attempt to manage the problem systematically, distinguishing between the deserving poor who should receive parish relief and the idle vagabonds who should be punished and set to work. Life expectancy was short, infant mortality high, and standards of living for most people remained basic. Witchcraft beliefs were widespread, and hundreds of alleged witches, mostly poor women, were tried and executed during the reign. Social hierarchy was rigid and divinely sanctioned, with expectations of deference from lower to higher orders strictly enforced. Education expanded during the period, with new grammar schools founded in market towns, but access remained limited primarily to boys from prosperous families. For the majority of the population, life meant agricultural labor, limited horizons, and vulnerability to forces beyond their control. Sources Elizabeth I. Anne Somerset, pp. 442–470, 8. The Life of Elizabeth I. Alison Weir, pp. 423–456. Elizabeth I. and Her Court, Susan Doran, pp. 130–167. The Later Reformation in England, Diarmaid MacCulloch, pp. 89–112. Part 6. Final Years and Legacy. Elizabeth's final years were marked by mounting difficulties that tarnished the luster of her earlier achievements. The war with Spain dragged on inconclusively, draining the treasury and requiring repeated parliamentary taxation. Military expeditions to France to support Henry IV against the Catholic League, and to the Netherlands to support the Dutch achieved limited results at great expense. Most disastrously, Ireland became a bleeding wound that consumed men and money without resolution. English rule in Ireland had long been tenuous, limited to the Pale around Dublin and scattered lordships, with much of the island under the control of Gaelic chieftains and Old English lords who resisted English authority. Elizabeth's government attempted to extend control through a combination of settlement, intimidation, and military force. The result was escalating resistance culminating in a major rebellion led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, beginning in the mid-1590s. English forces, commanded initially by incompetent or unlucky commanders, suffered humiliating defeats. The situation required a massive military commitment, over 17,000 troops by 1599, far larger than any force Elizabeth had deployed to the Netherlands or France. In 1599, Elizabeth appointed Robert de Vereux, Earl of Essex, to command the Irish campaign. Essex was young, charismatic, and ambitious, a favorite of the aging queen. His appointment proved catastrophic. Instead of confronting Tyrone decisively, Essex wasted the summer in futile skirmishing, then met Tyrone for a private negotiation without authorization and concluded an unsatisfactory truce. Defying Elizabeth's explicit orders, Essex abandoned his command and rushed back to England, bursting into the Queen's bedchamber at Nonsuch Palace in September 1599 before she was dressed or wigged. It was an unforgivable breach of decorum and duty. Elizabeth placed Essex under house arrest, and though he was eventually released, he was barred from court and denied the renewal of his monopoly on sweet wines, his major source of income. Desperate and resentful, Essex attempted a coup in February 1601. With a handful of supporters, he rode into London attempting to raise the city against the Queen's evil counselors. Londoners did not rally to him. The rebellion collapsed within hours, and Essex was arrested, tried, and executed on February 25, 1601. The episode was sordid and sad, the rebellion of a spoiled favorite who had overestimated his importance and underestimated his queen. Elizabeth signed the death warrant without the hesitation she had shown over Mary Stuart, and reportedly showed little emotion afterward. The financial strain of prolonged warfare forced Elizabeth to call Parliament frequently in her later years. The session of 1601 saw an acrimonious debate over monopolies, royal grants of exclusive trading rights that had been issued lavishly, and were widely resented as creating artificial scarcity and high prices. Elizabeth responded with her famous Golden Speech, delivered to a parliamentary delegation on November 30, 1601. In this speech, she acknowledged the problem of monopolies and promised reform, and she offered a moving reflection on her reign. "Though God hath raised me high, yet this I account the glory of my crown that I have reigned with your loves." It was vintage Elizabeth, combining concession with assertion of affection between herself and her subjects. By 1603, Elizabeth was 69 years old, ancient by the standards of her time. Her health declined through the winter. She suffered from insomnia, depression, and loss of appetite. She refused to go to bed for days, standing or sitting propped with cushions. Robert Cecil, William Cecil's son who had succeeded his father as principal minister, managed the regime's final business. The succession question, evaded for 45 years, could be evaded no longer. Elizabeth had always refused to name her heir, fearing that it would create a rival focus of loyalty. Now on her deathbed, she reportedly indicated, whether by speech or gesture the sources differ, that James VI of Scotland, son of Mary Stuart, should succeed her. James was Protestant, male, mature, and had a clear hereditary claim as the great-great-grandson of Henry VII. Cecil had already been in secret correspondence with James, preparing the succession. Elizabeth died at Richmond Palace in the early hours of March 24, 1603. The news was rushed to James in Scotland, and he began his journey south to claim his new kingdom. Elizabeth's death marked the end of the Tudor dynasty that had ruled England since 1485. Her body was brought by barge to Whitehall, and then with great ceremony to Westminster Abbey, where she was buried in the chapel of her grandfather Henry VII, later to be joined by the remains of her half-sister Mary in the same tomb. The monument erected over them bears the inscription, "Partners in throne and grave. Here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters, in hope of the resurrection." Historians' assessments of Elizabeth have varied over the centuries, shaped by changing political contexts and historiographical fashions. For Protestant Whig historians of the 18th and 19th centuries, Elizabeth was the champion of English liberty and Protestantism against Catholic tyranny. In the Victorian era, she was celebrated as a model of female capability within patriarchal constraints. 20th-century historians have offered more critical perspectives, noting her indecisiveness, her parsimony that sometimes left her forces undersupplied, her vanity and capacity for vindictiveness. Some recent scholarship has questioned whether her refusal to marry and provide an heir was a calculated strategy or a personal inability to surrender control, and whether the religious settlement she imposed achieved genuine stability or merely postponed conflict. What remains undeniable is that Elizabeth guided England through one of its most dangerous periods. She inherited a weak, divided, impoverished kingdom and left it independent, confident, culturally flourishing, and on the path to becoming a major power. Her political skills, her ability to inspire loyalty while maintaining authority, her management of competing factions, and her projection of a compelling public image were remarkable achievements. The England that emerged from her reign was recognizably Protestant in religion, increasingly aware of itself as a distinct nation with global ambitions, and possessed of a constitutional tradition that balanced royal prerogative with parliamentary participation. Elizabeth's personal rule, lasting 45 years, provided stability that allowed commerce, culture, and English identity to develop and mature. The age that bears her name was genuinely transformative in English history, and her personal contribution to that transformation was substantial. Whether she was a great queen by intention or circumstance, by calculation or luck, she remains one of history's most significant monarchs, and her reign remains a defining period in the making of Britain and the modern world. Sources Elizabeth. The Forgotten Years, John Guy, pp. 123-178, 289-341 Elizabeth I, Anne Somerset, pp. 521-572, 580-8612 Elizabeth I, Christopher Haig, pp. 156-180 To the Life of Elizabeth I, Alison Weir, pp. 467-512.